Hello and welcome to just another episode of Just Another Space podcast. Here as always with my co-host Clayton Swope, and we are very excited to have Julie Kearney with us today, a partner at DLA Piper, co-chair of the Space Exploration and Innovation practice there, and former and first chief of the Space Bureau at the Federal Communications Commission. Julie, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me.
We're gonna get in the weeds. We're gonna get wonky on spectrum and everything that enables space launch and space flight. But we always like to start with, well, let me start with this. Do you consider yourself a lawyer who's worked in space or a space lawyer?
Well, I think it sounds a lot cooler to say space lawyer, but I'm probably a lawyer who's worked in space.
So space found you. You didn't. You kind of it claimed you along the way.
Space brought me into its vortex.
Much like me and Clayton, I don't want to assume, but I'm guessing like you too. How do you go from lawyer to space lawyer? What's the journey that brought you here?
Well, I would love to tell you that. So I really would love to say that I've had this lifelong pull towards space and spent my youth dressing up as an astronaut for Halloween, but I didn't. And I do also want to say that when it comes to Star Trek versus Star Wars, I have to admit that I was an earlier Gen Xer with siblings who are older a little bit. And I'm the generation that finds it's okay to find the pros and cons of each. So maybe that's the lawyer in me finding a lever for both. But really, I think my journey to space just was plain old luck. Or maybe it was destiny. My journey is centered around communications and the technologies that enable us as humans to communicate, connect, and innovate. And all of this is for the benefit of humanity. So for me, space is about people and connecting worlds and people working together for a common goal. And space is incredibly collaborative. And doesn't it all boil down to communications? So at my core, I am a communications and technology lawyer. And whether it's in space or if it's down here on Earth, I've done undersea cables, I've done balloons in the stratosphere. But ultimately, that thread is communications. And we'll talk a little bit more about the Space Bureau at the FCC and how I really got to be embedded in the space sector. So, really excited that there was space for me.
Okay, but Star Trek, Julie, I have to ask this. If you're a Star Trek fan, and I am a Star Trek fan, I also like Star Wars. Do you
Yes.
have a favorite series?
So I have to say, I liked The Next Generation
Okay, preach,
and
preach.
and it kind of went a little, it jumped the shark for me a bit
But
after that.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay, yeah. I
Yeah.
liked Deep
Yeah.
Space Nine, but it was very different. I never really got
Yeah.
into Voyager and then Enterprise. I'm not even really sure. I think that only
I don't even
came
know
out
what that
2 seasons.
is.
Yeah,
Yeah.
see, wow. And then anything after that is just different.
Diminishing returns,
It's
huh?
just different.
But I do love Star Wars. And I was
I do too.
in grade school when Star Wars came out, and it's funny to have a teenager who's grown up, she's a digital native, and sees Star Wars and is sort of "That's really lame. I can't believe you thought this was so cool."
Yeah, yeah. Well, there's been enough content to keep, I think, future generations interested in Star Wars too. The
Yeah,
Disney sure is doing a good job at making sure that there's new stuff coming out all the time.
yeah,
Lost track of that too. There's so
yeah.
much.
In the Star Trek and Star Wars world, is there an FCC equivalent that we encounter based on your experience? Is there, what is it, the Federation? Is there like was there a U in that universe, that was governing communications between the planets and the ships?
It was more of a collaborative, for at the risk of getting labeled or showing up on a meme with Princess Leia buns, I might I might demur.
They had AI doing that by then, Tom. There
That's
there
right.
there was no FCC, but the AI was handling that.
I do like the question though. And I did love those Princess Leia.
Well, so how did you end up at the FCC? What was your journey that brought you there?
Well, how much time do you have? Let me start by saying I was a music major in college and a political science minor, and never in my wildest dreams would I have imagined working in space or working at the FCC as a 18 to 21-year-old in college. But I think because I had this liberal arts degree that enabled us and opened the path to do kind of anything you wanted. If you have a degree in your pocket and you know how to think and write and have abstract reasoning, then you can chart your own course. So I deferred and ultimately did not go to grad school for music, for vocal performance, as I was scheduled to do, but decided to go to law school 6 years out of college and went to Catholic University in Washington, D.C., the mecca of all policy in the US, and decided to pick Catholic because they had a communications law program led by the late, great Harvey Zuckman. And this is where I spent my time, and I interned at the FCC in the International Bureau, which was the the group that dealt with all the space and satellite issues. And I was adopted by one of the lawyers in the satellite policy division who took me to the first auction or the auction for satellite radio. Her name is Rosalie Shiera and was just an amazing mentor to me. And that's when I decided if I have some point when I can work at the FCC, then I will. But my journey was quite varied, starting with law. I'll tell you what I did. I was an intern, as I said. Then I spent a summer in Kiev. I had a large international law firm where I got the international bug. That was after my first year. And I was inspired by the power of telecom and tech to deliver health care. So I did a case study, a law review article on children in Pripyat, Ukraine, who had suffered from the Chernobyl accident and were getting telemedicine from a doctor in New York at the NYU Med School. So that was an interesting case in how telecoms can bridge and connect people and provide healthcare to rural and international areas. And then I was a summer associate my third year of between my second and third year at a company. There's a space connection here at a firm called Haley Bader and Potts. And they were the first counsel to MCI, if you remember them. And they had amazing lawyers who were very entrepreneurial, including Mike Bader, who was that counsel for MCI and is a household name in the broadcast industry. May he rest in peace. And public radio legends like John Krigler, now retired, and another broadcasting legal pioneer named Melody Virtue. And what's really cool is that Andrew Haley, the founder of Haley Bader and Potts, has been described as the world's first practicing space lawyer.
Huh.
So you should look him up. He's a fascinating guy, but it was the firm had very much of an entrepreneurial spirit, one of the boutiques in DC, and they are now part of Foster Garvey, a big Seattle firm. So went to MCI after Haley Bader and Potts. Remember long distance calls, right? And worked a lot at the ITU, working on settlement rates, if you know what those were.
And the ITU, just for the audience, the
Please.
international.
International Telecommunication. Yeah,
I didn't say
exactly.
it because I was worried I was going to get it wrong.
Well, and the great thing about MCI is, like, first of all, many of us are still friends 20 years later. It's a very collegial bar in DC, as you know, for space, satellite, telecom, and tech. And you just can't you can't walk around DC without bumping into someone who worked at MCI. And we worked in what was called the Lawyers Ghetto on 19th Street. Then I went from MCI to the Consumer Technology Association, set up their regulatory program, dealing with things like DTV transition and Spectrum. Spectrum will get there. Accessibility for people with disabilities to access technology and health tech, and was able to marry accessibility and health tech to get over-the-counter hearing aids, which you can get now, by the way, and privacy. And then went on to NPR, went back to CTA, went to Twilio. Then I went to Loon, which was part of Alphabet, and we were delivering interconnectivity to underserved and unserved areas in the world. And that was an amazing experience. Oh, through stratospheric balloons. Sorry, I buried the lead, where I was a, quote, space balloon lawyer, as we like to joke. But we were able to help provide the infrastructure to restore communications after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, and after devastating floods in Peru, and also after an earthquake there. So continuing on, I was just delighted when I was asked to join what would become the Space Bureau at the FCC to help set that up. We'll get into that in a little bit, but I have to say, I really didn't think I would have the opportunity to work in government in this late stage in my career. And when I got the call, I felt like this was just a gift. And again, we'll have a little more of a deep discussion there. But for those who have not served in government, if you ever can, I highly recommend the experience.
That's such a good endorsement. I mean, Clayton and I are both, government people
Yeah.
in our past lives, and I know it was hugely impactful on us. So I love hearing the story that you chose government again all those years after the internship and that experience. I've got like a dozen questions from like what you just
Let's
shared because
bring it.
you might be the world's most interesting woman, talking through the various things. I think starting with, so what took you to Kiev? Was that somewhere you always wanted to go study or live, or was there another connection?
Well, I have my brother and my sister-in-law to thank. They were working in Kyiv at the World Bank. That was my brother, and my sister-in-law was at the European Bank, and one of their good friends was managing partner at a law firm whose name I will not mention in Kyiv. And so they brought me in, and I got to spend the summer there. It was incredible. I can't thank them enough for making that opportunity available to me. I was basically an intern for the summer.
What a great at that time, even now, not where a lot of Americans would have gone even before the
Yeah.
current conflict, so to get that exposure and
Right, and this was 1996, so still pretty freshly independent, and it taught me so much about what sort of the importance of international diplomacy and understanding other cultures and just really realizing that you have to keep an open mind, and, you both know this really well, and listen, a lot of listening, taking in. So, yes, a large international law firm, not DLA Piper.
yeah, and, you think you fast forward to your experience, I'm sure, throughout your career working with the various companies and associations, but particularly with the ITU, where for
Yeah,
those who aren't familiar, and you can articulate this better than me or Clayton, but you're really interacting in this big international forum, very high stakes diplomacy and
right.
negotiations, right? I mean, did that serve you well for that later experience?
Absolutely. And I think understanding where countries are, meeting them where they are, and understanding what the potential is if you help them bridge their technology gaps or understanding what it is they need for the people. I thought for some, well, this is a podcast, but I thought it was interesting in later things where people will ask, can you do XYZ? And you say, well, yes, we can do XYZ. Well, we don't want you to do XYZ. And then understanding why. Clearly there's something in that government or in that country that they need to know what all the capabilities are and why you have them and how you're going to be storing their data or how it's I think it's really important. You can't just go in with one specific viewpoint. You need to understand where they're coming from and help to move along discussions or understanding. But it's I love the international piece.
And then I'm so curious about Loon. You mentioned Project Loon, which is fascinating. I think it's since been are they still doing that or have they wound it down?
No. So that was we were wound down in early 2022. Actually, I think the end was late 2022 was the ultimate wind down, but that was a case where Alphabet was loath to provide more funding. So unfortunately, we did graduate, and then we were working on getting investment. And at the point where the pandemic was difficult, but we were successfully launched in Kenya, and we were working with Vodacom in Mozambique. These are public, so and other countries as well were really interested. So I feel like there was still we still had a lot more growth, and it was sad. But the technology does live on in other companies, which I think is one of the things where it's not a brand name anymore, but it is in other companies, the IP, and then one of the whole software-defined networking spun off to another company that is really doing amazing work. So we live on. And actually and many of us are still dear friends. We have reunions every quarter or half year. Gosh, 100 plus of us just got together in Mountain View and
Wow.
had yeah, so we're all really, really still close because when you have that type of intensity and that type of passion, it's just hard to walk away from the people who are just incredibly important in your life.
Or do you launch a balloon whenever you all get together to signal the bonds?
Yes,
I feel like that's the only champagne and then
that's
launch a
right,
high
the
altitude
bubbles,
balloon.
bubbles,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly. I was gonna say, something like, college related. Didn't they fill balloons with beer or something? I don't know.
Tossing them down. Well,
That's right.
your window when doing that, it was sort of in a I think Starlink might have just been getting going, and there were
Right.
obviously applications for these proliferated LEO, datacom constellations, but really what you were doing was filling that a lot of that same market gap with Loon, right before the satellites were largely serving that community at an affordable price point.
Right, and so and I should have mentioned that there is still so high altitude platform station HAPS, they are still very much alive, and there's HAPS Alliance, and several companies are involved, and so HAPS is still very much a going venture, and there is a gap that they fill between the LEO constellations and others, so there is still very much, I believe actually, I don't want to endorse, I should do my disclaimer. The views expressed during the podcast are my own, but there is very much a market for that, I think,
Yeah, is
perhaps.
that I actually am curious about that, not to go down too many rabbit holes here,
Yeah.
but is that more for niche applications like, hey, there's a part of the world where that satellite coverage is difficult, or in an emergency situation, or first responder? What is sort of the
All of
difference
the above.
between
All of the
all the
above. All of the above, yeah.
Yeah. And
So
I think most Americans probably didn't start thinking about high altitude balloons until the Chinese one floated across our, TV screens about 2 years
right,
ago. But you all were out doing this and providing this coverage long before
exactly.
that.
And we were not around when those balloons came out, and there were yes. Phew, it's not ours.
No, no F
Right, right. Exactly, exactly. But it was really just anyway, we'll get back into Loon, I think, a bit later, but I really just felt like it was such an important company for showing what can be done and identifying the needs that were being shown across Africa, across a lot of other territories that just don't have the access. So to get an email from someone in Kenya saying thank you, I've never had reliable internet, and for the first time ever, thanks to Loon and our partner Telecom Kenya, I have it. And the so that
That's
just
really cool.
yeah, was really incredible.
Yeah, and I think about the period, that you sort of described in your career, obviously a lot going on there and all the different modes of telecom, but particularly with the rise in internet traffic on the undersea cables, which I'd love
Yeah,
to get into. Also, you think about that first Iridium constellation that went up, I
yeah,
think was it the mid-90s, kind of as you were starting your career, you said. You've
yeah,
sort of been, and I think it leads into what you did at the FCC eventually, but kind of on the cutting edge, it sounds like, of a lot of these kind of changing global telecom applications and ways we're connecting people. Have what's like your biggest takeaway from the various private sector and then government roles you've had? Is like, is there any big takeaway? Are we seeing a constant iteration and evolution of those ways? Is it we're seeing refinement of those different modes? I don't know, as someone who's not a telecom person by background, I use it like all of us, we use it every day, we don't think about it. What
right.
was your big takeaway from watching that evolution of that capability?
I think my big takeaway is that human ingenuity is truly endless, and that if we have people who are creating ways to communicate, to have companies invest and have hybrid solutions, so taking the telecom market as a trying to make it unsiloed, that you have companies that are relying on things like undersea cable. Now they're relying on space. Now traditional wireline companies are now embedded with wireless and cable. And you put all these things together, and ultimately, we continue to make them faster, better, cheaper. Competition, people are realizing that it's important to have choice. I think we still have a ways to go, but my big takeaway is if you build it, they will come. And companies want to be able to deliver, I hope, services that are cheaper and more reliable and sustainable. So I think as long as we have people who continue to innovate, we'll have people who want to take up those innovations.
So the demand is organically there, it's kind of insatiable as long as
I think so.
it's reasonably affordable and available, it's gonna get which is unique, right? I think a lot of markets don't operate that way.
Right.
We have an insatiable need to communicate and connect and be entertained and collaborate, which is kinda fascinating.
Yeah. And I mean, you look at some of the entrenched markets, and I won't name them, but they're looking at over the top services, right? That they're having to come along and say, okay, well, I'm going to have to embrace this new method of delivery because that's what consumers are demanding.
Is, in your career, like, when you go back and look, and this sort of takes us a little bit closer to your time at the FCC and the creation of the Bureau of Space, did you foresee that growth and that demand for space-based telecom for the masses? Or did that kinda catch, maybe, I don't know, industry and the policy community by surprise that we got there that quickly for something that historically had been sort of a bespoke military or government application?
I don't know if it took people by surprise. I think it's really a natural evolution. A lot, look at the internet came out of research and military, and here we are that it's commercial. So I think I'd say the trajectory was probably, I don't think it was a huge surprise.
And maybe I'm wrong. I've kind of always felt like the broadband connectivity telecom people were different than the space people, and that they sometimes speak different languages, and the audience for the messaging is very different. But that for satellite connectivity, you did kind of have a marrying of those two communities, but
Yes.
they still feel a little different to me. I guess I thought though that I don't know who, what came first, the chicken or the egg, but when we're talking about a low Earth orbit broadband, non-geostationary service, I think I saw a lot of companies that I would put in the space category, when launch was hot.
Right.
Look at SpaceX is the big one. I also think of Boeing. I also think of Astra. I think of now Spin Launch,
Yeah.
companies that were based around launch, but that they thought that satellite connectivity would be effectively a way to, I guess you say, a foundational customer for their space vision. That it wasn't like an add-on necessarily because it's satellites in space and building satellites, that's part of the space community. But it did feel like this thing that, oh, we could sell that. That
Yeah.
sounds good. Let's sell that. Let's build and sell that. There's a market outside the government, and then we get to do all our cool space stuff.
Hmm. If you
And
build it, they will come.
yeah, or just recognizing that there is a big consumer market for broadband. There's a enterprise customer set for broadband for the private side and then the government side, and just seemed like a big pot of money that they wanted to tap into. But I always felt like that community, at least that I'm more tied to, that was just like a means to the end of doing this cool space stuff. Launch. They wanted to do space, but they had to do connectivity. So that's how I perceived it, but maybe that just speaks to me being part of the space community. So, just
It's your launch
Julie, I
bias,
think you
Clayton.
kind of have you've had one foot in, yeah, well, maybe it's my bias. I'm admitting that. You've had one foot in that community that I'm talking about, and then one foot
Yeah.
in the connectivity, telecommunications spectrum community. Do you see it that way? And then I will always curious, are the broadband people, are they "Oh, we'll just convince these silly people on the space side to let us hitch a ride, or will use the investment they've made in the launch to do our business better and cheaper?" So, again, I don't know what it looks like from that side, but I'm my question really there, just kinda, put a boop, dot on that or cross the T there is, uh, are there 2 communities? Did you ever see that, or is this something that is a figment, of my, imagination?
It is not. I think you're right. I think that telecom has always been a part of obviously the comms piece is vitally important. And I think that the commercial space community may not, I'm trying to say this in a way that's diplomatic. Views are expressed are my own, but I do feel like we worked really hard at the Space Bureau, at the FCC, to assure the space community, the traditional space community, that we were part of the whole community, that we were coming in to be a responsible collaborative participant, but that we knew where our jurisdiction was. And we knew that we had broad jurisdiction, but that the jurisdiction wasn't limitless. Like, we understand and appreciate what you're doing. We're not here to take away or make your work more difficult, but we are here. And the commercial broadband community and the commercial benefits of satellites are very much intricately related to what the FCC does.
Definitely, yeah, and just even the language though, the NGSO, vice low Earth
Yeah,
orbit, LEO, that's different, and then I remember again, I'm biased, I'm coming from the space side, people talk about a space station, and I'm like, "A
right.
space station?" And they're
Right.
like, "No, no, no, they mean a satellite." And I'm like, "Who are these people? Why don't they just say a satellite?" And I'm like, "Oh, it's the spectrum people." So I even
Right.
felt like even on some basic terminology, it was like when people say, "Oh, we'll go to Ireland or we'll go to the UK," it's, 2 people separated, what is it? One people separated by 2 languages or something
Right.
like that. It's like, "Oh, yeah, they really do say things differently there, even though we're speaking the same language." So I just felt like I saw a manifestation of that, even in
Yeah.
just the vocabulary.
Yeah, well, I mean, even on the Hill, you have committees of jurisdiction, right? So
Oh, yeah.
right? So I think the process is going to be iterative to have the, "Oh, we're here doing this work, and it is an important component of the entire ecosystem," but I don't think we're necessarily mutually exclusive.
Right,
Does
definitely.
that make sense?
And we're
And
right, no,
yeah.
and I mean, another thing is just I felt like on the space side, and I'll say this, I'm not necessarily, not asking you, Julie, for comment, but when things that were kind of in that category that the space people thought, "No, this is ours," debris in orbit, for example. "How dare
Right.
these FCC people get involved in that? They don't know what they're talking about." And I just felt like that was just yet another example where it does feel like we built the barricades, and then there are these people making these decisions over here. They don't know what they're talking about. It's very
Right.
separate from us, and that uh, it was viewed as a very much foreign entity trying to
Right.
impose
Right.
any, and not even again asking for you to say whether or not that was right or wrong, or even me giving a moral judgment on it. Just an observation that it did feel to me, at least in the space community, that there was this. Who are these people?
Yeah, absolutely. And that is definitely something coming in and setting up the Space Bureau that I was aware of and certainly empathetic toward. And that's really why we will talk about that a little more in the podcast about marrying the different communities and educating and having people understand where we were and why, but that it wasn't a we're here, we're gonna eat everyone's lunch and because that was absolutely in fact, I think that the conversations we had in terms of the intergovernmental collaboration became even more robust. And I think coming from industry, having the opportunity of so many years in industry where we were looking at rules, trying to enter countries and say, well, this rule, maybe we could work with this rule, or maybe we could try to change it. So I'm not one of these hyper regulatory, we must have rules. It's more, do the rules make sense? What are the rules meant to do? And why do we have them? If they don't make sense, then maybe we ought to look at a redo or a review and see where we can make some gains in terms of having a market that is hospitable for
Yeah.
old and new entrants alike. So that I think bridging those different divides in the government, I think are really important. I don't like silos. I really don't like silos. But if there need to be silos, I get it.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because you think about the FCC, I think it's almost 100 years old.
Yes, just had our 100-year anniversary.
Already,
Uh-huh.
wow.
Yeah,
That's
yeah, yeah.
so really one of the oldest regulator agencies in America,
Yep,
maybe the oldest, I actually don't know, which is kind of fascinating. And then you go to the other end, you got, like, the Office of Space Commerce at,
right.
DOC that they're trying to build up, and it's like, "Yeah, regulatory, we're really here to
Have we been
promote."
doing this
Yeah,
podcast longer than
yeah,
they've been around?
exactly,
Just kidding.
barely, I
No,
think we're
probably
neck
not.
and neck.
Probably not.
But and then you got the FAA and, NASA and DoD kind of in the middle there, and
Yeah,
so it's such an interesting domain, and maybe it's always this way when you've got, like, a new market and government domain that's the technology's bleeding edge and changing constantly, but I actually always had this sympathy for the FCC that maybe I'm just being nice to the audience here, but, like, you guys come in and you're like, "We have this very important job to do in this very established way of doing it with this very mature, high stakes market that has little margin for error." And then the space community is a little bit like, who are you? And, we're just experimenting out here with rockets and new things, and
yeah,
some may work and some may not. And that marrying of those two cultures is so, I see it as healthy because it shows a maturing. The very fact that, and I want to get into how the Bureau of Space came to be, but the very fact that we got there with the FCC and your leadership and they brought you in to do that was a reflection of the maturing of that market and that domain.
yeah.
Which sometimes I think some of the stakeholders in the commercial space community in particular struggle with, like, "Leave me in my sandbox to go play with toys and no government over here, please." So, how did we get to that point? What happened that led the FCC to recruit you to come in and do this and take that step?
Yeah, and, as we continue, I'm going to answer your question, but I do want to talk about the intergovernmental collaboration. But I'll do that, I think, in the context of setting up the bureau. First of all, I appreciate that you're recognizing the FCC has been involved in licensing spectrum for space missions and satellites for decades. And in fact, in 1962, the FCC was very involved in Telstar 1. They assisted in the first commercial communication satellite launched into space. And in 2022, more than 6 decades later, then FCC Chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel saw an important opportunity to ensure that the FCC's practices could support a new space economy. She just had this brilliant idea. Why don't we have a space bureau, a standalone bureau within the FCC? And she is a woman of first, was the first Senate confirmed woman to lead the FCC. And under her leadership, the FCC was the very first telecom agency in the world to have a standalone space bureau. And to sum it up, the bureau was built to, or the bureau was designed to build on the success of the satellite and space ecosystem and to ensure the ongoing success. And I credit the chairwoman for having this vision like, hey, there's so much happening. We're getting so many applications, so many novel applications for space activities. We should just have a bureau because this is going to be front and center, and I want us to be the first. So I'll take just a little quick down memory lane. Balmy fall day, November 3rd, 2022, the chairwoman announced at the National Press Club that we were, as the FCC, going to be supporting the space economy even more robustly. And she was going to do a reorg of what was then the International Bureau that had a satellite division doing the same work. And that she was going to be boosting up the staff, resources, and the visibility of the work that was happening. And so she just basically said, look, the industry is growing rapidly. The licensing frameworks aren't keeping up. And if we're going to be a premier space economy here in the US, then we need to put our resources where we're going to attract investment and also to support those who are innovating. So here we are, also recognizing that a lot of these technologies require access to radio frequency spectrum. So, with unanimous support on both sides of the aisle and with congressional approval, the chairwoman officially launched the Bureau uh, on April 11th, 2023. And I had the good fortune of building it and leading it for 2 years until February of this year. So I'll just give you, if helpful, a sense of the dynamic activity that the chairwoman saw as really warranting why we need to have a space bureau and what we saw. This is stuff I provided at the last open meeting of Chairwoman Rosenworcel's leadership in January of 2025. So look at this trajectory. 2020, there were 104 launches with payloads. In 2024, there were 254 launches with 2,541 payloads. Back in 2020, there were just 2,000 operational satellites in the sky, approximately. And today, there are just under 11,000 in orbit. And so at the FCC, you can see just the number of applications has increased so dramatically, almost by 21% each year since calendar year 2020. So I don't know, would it be helpful for me to talk a little bit about how the FCC or why the FCC regulates commercial satellites or the regulatory
Yeah,
authority? Okay.
I think it would be, and I'm assuming that you can't do literally anything in space without radio frequency involvement. Is that fair?
Pretty much. I mean, there is a common denominator there. And that's why when people say, well, what do you have to do with it? Well, it's like we kind of have like a lot to do with it. Because even for the federal side, they need to know where the non-federal commercial actors are. But as background, this is where I geek out. The FCC's authority to regulate commercial satellite comes from the Communications Act of 1934, as amended by the Telecom Act of 1996, lovingly referred to as the Lawyers Lifetime Employment Act of 1996. And the FCC's mandate licensing radio communications within the US, issuing regs to prevent interference. No one likes harmful interference. Licensing requirements for non-federal stations, that's commercial stations. And we have authority to grant licenses. We, the FCC, I don't work there anymore, carrying out provisions of the Communications Act or those in international treaties as relates to radio communications. So think ITU, International Telecom Union, radio regulations. And most practitioners will note that the FCC authority is pretty broad, but it's not limitless. And the FCC rules for satellite licensing procedures are governed by Part 47 of the Code of Federal Regulations. And there are parts for satellite licensing for non-federal stations, 3 types of licenses. Orbit and service the process depends on the orbit and service. And common features of an application are an orbital debris mitigation plan, which I know you guys want to talk about. That's required. Filing with the International Telecommunication Union for global coordination. Fun fact, the current Secretary General and first woman Secretary General of the International Telecommunication Union, Doreen Bogdan Martin, is a former NTIA, National Telecommunication and Infrastructure Agency staffer, and a friend to many of us in the global telecommunications ecosystem. I think many people know Doreen. She's fabulous. And then the third common feature is communications with an Earth station in the US or within a US jurisdiction. So we look at those. The FCC, sorry, I keep saying we, they look at those, but they also have a market access process through which foreign licensed systems can get licenses in the US. So I think people are familiar with these satellites that the FCC has been known for. So fixed satellite service, FSS, which you'll recognize if you're watching a live football game being broadcast from another location. MSS is called mobile satellite service, used in the US for the first satellite phones, broadcasting or direct broadcast DBS service, like satellite digital audio radio service or DARS. So I'd say probably most people in the not too distant past had no idea that they were using a satellite or that their phone or TV or radio were actually coming from satellite services. I think you mentioned that, Tom. Like, I had no idea, but so many of you were. And now we've got low Earth orbit satellites. So people are starting to get into the vernacular of, yeah, satellites, of course. I know what these are, commercial satellites. There's another quick area, too, that the FCC works with as well, and that's coordinating with other federal government partners and recognizing that there's a shared success that depends on the collaboration of working together as one government. So spectrum coordination from the FCC, they work really closely together with the Department of Commerce or NTIA and the FAA for launches. It's the Office of Commercial Space Transportation, Department of Commerce again, NOAA, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, Office of Space Commerce, which is new, also a fantastic group of people within the Department of Commerce, DoD, the State Department, and the National Space Council. So, and then there's communication policy. So you just keep going. NASA, NOAA, FAA, Department of Commerce. And again, these are groups that talk to each other all the time. So no agency is an island. And that's what makes the job really exciting because you're learning and you're iterating and you're figuring out how are we going to get these systems up or how are we going to get these small satellites to serve in the US or to just, help with climate change monitoring and wildfire detection. So there is a lot and they all depend on communications, lunar communications. We'll talk about that in a bit too. So I think I had the coolest job.
Yeah. Well, not many people can say they stood up like the first I don't know the last time the FCC added a new bureau, but that's pretty historic. I'm sure it's been a little while.
Yeah, it was I can't remember if Public Safety Homeland Security was the most recent bureau, but that was, many years ago. So, and the International Bureau, of course, was back in the mid 90s. So, yeah, it was amazing. And I give so much credit to the staff because I was able to build on the really talented staff in the International Bureau front office. And then we had so many talented people within the satellite division. But then the chairwoman and the chairwoman's office and many within the commission were just so supportive of bringing on more people. This is what industry needed. This is what industry constantly said was a point of difficulty with the number of applications and innovations that they needed to get approved. And you still have to do it responsibly, and you have to make sure that you're not just green lighting everything that comes in the door, but there is a lot of careful review to make sure that what's going up is going up responsibly and thoughtfully.
I assume that's kinda how the idea of doing, orbital debris mitigation plan came about, that idea of having your licensees, or I say your, FCC's licensees
Yeah.
do things responsibly. How far does that go back? Is that something that the FCC was doing in the '90s, in the '80s? Is that more recent than that?
Yeah. So the first orbital debris rules adopted by the FCC were in 2004. So that was 20 years ago. In fact, during my tenure, we had a 20th anniversary celebration in
Wow, okay.
February 2024 as part of what we called our Transparency Initiative event, and I'll talk about Transparency Initiative. But yes, we
That's
had,
a while. That's a
yeah,
while. Star
yeah.
Trek Voyager might have still been on live at that
I
point, or at least
believe so.
Enterprise.
And if you talk to Carl Kensinger, who many in the space community know, Carl Kensinger, we call Carl the OG of orbital debris, and he was working on this, I believe, 10 years prior to that. So the first
Okay.
rules were 2004, but one of the first things he did when he started at the Space Bureau was to look at orbital debris and the FCC's responsibility to make sure that these satellites have a plan to mitigate their footprint in space.
That's any satellite, any licensee that's putting anything into space has to submit the plan so that they don't create, or how they're going to manage
Right.
end of life
How
operations.
yeah, how they're gonna deorbit. And for context, so in September 2024, I visited the Aerospace Corporation in El Segundo, and they have a space debris garden. And there were these huge chunks of debris from 2 satellites that had returned to Earth.
They both landed right there at aerospace?
Oh, yeah, it's so funny,
What are
it's
the
so
odds of
funny.
that?
I know, it's so funny, yeah, right there, like, perfectly, there was like a landing, little, like, X marks the spot. No.
Like a
So
big
they have
magnet, they have a big magnet, just sucks
exactly.
all the debris in. That's the debris mitigation plan
It's a
for
derby exactly, yes, the magnet. I know you're onto something. So, but I also heard, like, there was this Ariane's breakup in 1986 that caused 500 trackable pieces of debris. And this is also on Aerospace's website. They have a lot of really helpful information. But it was just sort of this like healthy reminder that one object going up can cause complete bedlam to what's already there. And if you're making investments like many companies are, do you really want your you want your multi-million dollar satellite to be nicked by, some
no one wants
floating trash?
collisions, no, right. And how does that change as you go further away from Earth, though, too? I think, we had, someone on our podcast from, Astroforge, which is
Yeah.
one of the companies that wants to do mining on asteroids, and
And very
it makes
complimentary of the FCC, by the
they
way.
were, yeah,
Yes,
Oh
actually,
yeah.
everyone
yeah.
that we've had, everyone is like a love fest for the FCC.
They're
But it's just,
great.
like, really interesting stuff that it sounds like they just come in to you and say, "Hey, we don't know where to check the box on your form because our satellite's not gonna be orbiting Earth anymore, it's going into deep space, so
Yeah.
this debris mitigation thing of deorbiting after 5 years is not really gonna apply." And it sounds like FCC's been very, accommodating to figure out what a solution would look like. So to me, I guess I'm just curious, what for all of these missions that are going even into lunar orbit or beyond. I mean, I know we haven't had any, commercial missions planned for Mars, but we might. So to me, I'm wondering, what does that form look like? How does that, do you think, make sense for, things that are gonna be on the horizon that, aren't really in Earth orbit anymore?
Well, I think what really needs to happen, and I found this in several other companies where I worked. If the rules maybe don't completely fit,
Yeah.
it's really good to talk to your regulator.
Yeah.
And that's where at the FCC during my time, we had something called the Transparency Initiative, where we had 6 different workshops. And if you go on the FCC.gov backspace space, you'll see Transparency Initiative. And it's just frequently asked questions and how to's and what does this rule mean? But I believe, at least during my tenure, and hopefully ongoing, there's very much a we want to help you get your satellites up. We want to have the least bit of friction possible for you. If you have questions about your application, please ask us. Also, please call your lawyers or outside advisors as
Get those
you
space
know,
lawyers in the
yeah,
room.
very, very
Where's our
That's
space
right.
lawyers?
that's right, that's right, that's right. So, very important. But I believe that if there are bespoke applications or bespoke questions that talk to the regulator.
Yeah. No, it sounds like
Yeah.
that's what's been going well. I don't know. I think Tom and I both noted that, especially from the Astroforge conversation.
I think it's
Yeah,
interesting because
yeah.
Clayton and I, we talk a lot, and there's all this consternation around
We
we
talk a
need
lot.
mission authorization. We do talk a lot, about, like well, it's funny because what I saw, what was some of the reaction when the orbital debris mitigation topic came up around the Bureau of Space and this stuff, you see all this like, "Oh, can you believe these owners' conditions?" And then you talk to people that go,
Totally.
"There's like, oh, super easy. They were really great." It was the
Right.
same with the FAA, Office of Commercial Space Transportation, on, like, the de facto mission authorization. It was like you would have thought hearing some of the complaints like, it was like doing your taxes, and it's like, here's one page, like, "Do you promise
Right.
not to carry nukes, and will you tell us where you're going?" And I was like,
That was
"That's
it,
it?
right?
That's the
That was
whole
it.
thing?"
The onerous
But
process
people
people complain about.
yeah, yeah, and they'll stand up here and say, like, "The reason I can't get my mission done or close my investment round is because of this horrible rule or obligation." And you look at it, you go like, gosh, that's a heck of a thing to struggle to meet. So it is funny hearing you talk, and then independently, like we said, we've had some of your former customers or stakeholders, whatever you call them in the case of the FCC, that have gone through it and gone like, super easy, really helpful, not a problem.
Yeah.
And so I hope to our broad audience, we're dispelling the myth that there's this like bureaucracy that grinds innovation
Wants to
to a
say
halt.
no. Yeah, that just wants to say no. And it sounds to
Right.
me everything we hear on our podcast is that the bureaucracy wants to get to yes, and FCC, as you mentioned, is one of those ones that tries very hard to get to yes.
I'm really happy to hear that, and I think that is the spirit in which the the staff really does want to promote. It is to everyone's benefit to get applications and activities and novel activities out the door and up into space, or if they're Earth stations, on Earth. But ultimately to say yes.
Right.
It's so much easier to get to yes if you have collaboration. And that's what I loved about being there, that there were just a lot of conversations about, okay, this one's really tricky. How do we make this happen without interfering over here or causing this issue or having this government agency that we're working with, say, oh, that's just not going to work. I think one thing I found really interesting, and people who've heard me talk hear me say this a lot. You'd have when I was in industry or even in government, someone says, I hate all the regulations. You have to get rid of them. And you say, okay, all right, which ones should we get rid of? Well, maybe just a few regulations.
Bad ones, Julie, the bad ones.
We really need those so we know what to build to. Because if there's nothing, then we don't know what to build to. And then it's, well, if there are regulations, you should regulate them, but not regulate us. So it is this, it's so condition dependent. So when people say, like, oh, get rid of all the regulations, they're terrible. Well, I think that would be chaos. But you need to just strike the balance between what gives people enough certainty to build and what gives us enough security, and not security like cybersecurity, but just in the whole global ecosystem. What helps us? If we go too crazy, then what happens?
Well, in the case of the FCC and the Space Bureau, quite literally, it is, do you want your satellite to operate through its radio frequency without interference so you're getting the full value of
Right.
like, to me, it's again, I'm not just pandering to our guest here. It's like actually in your
I'll take it.
business interest to make sure everybody's abiding by the rules so your thing actually works the way
Right.
you want it to serve your customers or your stake. It seems to be a no-brainer 'cause, when it comes to frequency, it's one area where you can't really go it alone, right? It becomes
Yeah.
chaos so quickly.
I heard someone speaking the other day, and I thought it was interesting. And I won't name names and I won't name locations, but someone had said, well, I just am telling people to go to this other place to license because, well, we don't like the rules. And so another panelist spoke up and said, whoa, 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 we don't want to race to the bottom here. And I thought that was really interesting, not just the fact that it was industry self regulating in a way that wait, we have to work together and collaborate where we see tweaks or changes need to be made here in the US. Let's figure that out. Let's not say right? Let's go somewhere else. Even if someone does go somewhere else, it doesn't mean that they would be able to provide service in the US. But I thought that was an interesting
Uh-huh.
self-regulation. Like, oh, hey, dude.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, yeah, be careful when you start pulling that thread, right, where it and
Right.
you think about it, like, the US and the FCC being such a leader on this has really created a permissive I kinda wanna get to the international discussion here of, like,
Yeah.
a permissive environment for novel technologies and applications and markets. You think about, I think about Russia, you think about China, maybe some other countries. If they were the dominant, I would say, power in maybe the free market side of spectrum use, we might have a very different set of rules or way these things were enforced, but it's sort of a testament to US leadership in this space. Is that fair characterization or
Sure. I love it.
not to put words in your mouth, but it
I love
really
it.
yeah, it's like I'm curious about like when you go to ITU and you're representing the FCC or you're a delegate, from industry on behalf of the United States as people sometimes are. What do you find when you engage with maybe some of the countries that don't fully share our perspectives or kind of similar, commercial markets? How is it interacting with the foreign governments and stakeholders in that environment?
Yeah, so I won't speak for the FCC's Office of International Affairs, OIA, which is currently led by Tom Sullivan as the acting chief. And Tom has been, he was the chief before under the previous administration, 45. And so his group manages that. The FCC Space Bureau, of course, works closely with them to inform the decisions and the discussions that are happening. So I'll weave around how the governments that may not align completely work, but every 4 years, there's something called the world governments gather together to get international consensus around wireless policy. This is at the World Radio Communication Conference, or WRC, and the next WRC, held by the International Telecom Union, will be held in 2027. So that's how we globally harmonize scarce spectrum resources in a 5-week event. Spectrum resources to support communications that we count on every day, like our smartphones. And the agendas are set years in advance. And work for the next WRC, or WARC, is taking place right now. The US has a whole process for gathering US industry stakeholders, government stakeholders. The U.S. process is called the WAC, the World Radio Communication Conference Advisory Committee, and it just seeks public sector participation to develop U.S. positions. I should note that from the WAC, that feeds into the State Department led process, and you have key people from really everything: NASA, DoD, state, FCC, FAA, and other groups, and NTIA, alphabet soup. So, plus industry stakeholders. State Department is the spokesperson. So, in terms of working with there are people, this is what they work on all year, day in, day out, working on the US positions, developing consensus internally so then they can work with allies all over the world. I probably can't say a whole lot more since that was not my domain, but potentially another podcast idea to talk about the World Radio Communication Conference, because it really does impact you and me on a very granular level about how we're going to be able to communicate in the years ahead. The WRC 2027, 80% of the items on the agenda are space related.
No kidding.
Space and
Wow.
satellite. Yeah, this is unheard of. So this is completely novel that we have. They're calling it the space work because there's so much that is going to be topical for not just for 2027, but even going into 2031.
Wow.
Space
That's
is
a
the place.
fascinating stat, yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and it
yeah,
really validates the decision of the FCC to reorganize around this if
yeah.
that's what's driving a lot of the activity.
Exactly. And I haven't even talked about what we did when I was at the commission, and this is ongoing, but the direct to device, or it's called supplemental coverage from space, to deliver from satellites, telecom services direct to the end user. So it's the marrying of terrestrial, wireless, and satellite.
As you look out, and again, I won't ask you for like a technical assessment, but how much do you see for the wireless operators as we look, our cell phones, mobile phones with old habits, right?
Yeah.
Like, how much of that is gonna be terrestrial towers versus, as you think about satellite direct to device, is it gonna be a hybrid? Is it gonna be do you think, like, 5, 10 years from now, it'll still be predominantly terrestrial because of the physics of how these things work with some supplemental, satellite, or do you see a shift to much more 50-50 ratio?
I wish I could answer, but I probably can't. I know that as we develop the technologies, that it's really anyone's guess at this point how far we can go. But I think the fact that the terrestrial and the satellite are marrying in a lot of ways, I think it's just a question of, yes, how far can our engineers and our technologists push the technology? So that's a non-answer, huh?
That's a fair it's probably a smart answer.
Yo, I just got here. I want to keep my job.
Yeah, I was gonna say. Well, Clayton, I know we're pushing up against the time here, and I wanna get time in for a lightning round. Anything before we jump into that? All right. Well, Julie, as you may know, as a longtime listener of our podcast here,
Yes.
we like to do some lightning round questions at the end, kind of getting at maybe some of the more fun or personal stories throughout your career and space. So we already covered the great Star Wars versus Star Trek debate. We kind of started with a lightning round, but I do want to say, in your career, did you ever get down for a space launch? Was there a particular memory
Oh
early in your career or during your time at the FCC that stands out?
my gosh, so many. Bringing a delegation from Africa to Puerto Rico when I was at Loon to demonstrate how our launches took place and the coordination and the spectrum issues. But doing a launch with this delegation and launching the balloon and having one of the delegates from this country say, "We'll see you in" name your country. That was just amazing. Working with people with disabilities to make technology accessible, so over the counter hearing aids, working on legislation and working with the FDA, and ultimately having the legislation approved, signed into law, and now consumers can get hearing aids over the counter. People with mild to moderate hearing loss, but just seeing a regulatory roadblock and saying, you know what, there's such a need, and working with the entire community of researchers and doing our own studies to show that there's so much benefit to allowing people, like you get glasses over the counter, that if you make this accessible to people, you are deterring a lot of functional and cognitive loss because hearing and cognitive loss are as you age are shown to be tied together. So, and then I did get to see a launch and I did get to go to Kennedy Space Center with the chairwoman where she met the crew of the Artemis mission, Artemis 2. And I have told this story before, but seeing two of the astronauts flying themselves back to Houston waving to us as they took off to fly back. That was just one of those breathtaking Top Gun moments that you just never get to recreate. But having the opportunity as well, and this is more dispersed, not one single experience, but being able to go out and visit many, many of the satellite and space companies and rocket companies at their locations and seeing what they're doing and what they're forecasting and how they're using tech to just improve humanity. And I just loved being able to have this hands-on tactile approach to regulating because it's easy to just stay in your office and look at paper, but if you can't be out there talking to innovators and talking to companies that are really trying to make a go of it, it's a little I think it's a little harder to regulate. And we did actually have the bureau went out quite a bit, especially locally, to make sure that they were, and the neighbors in the DC area so they could understand what it is that the technology is trying to accomplish and how the regulations either help or potentially hinder. So I
That's
loved that. And that was multiple experiences. And for me, I really loved that ability to say we're partners in all of this. It's not a you versus us or an us versus them, it's a us.
it's cool to hear clearly you're so passionate about the work you did there. I mean, it comes through. And at a time when a lot of people are leaving government right now, what advice would you have for somebody? Because you obviously interned for government and then spent a career in the private sector. What advice would you have for people who've never worked in government thinking about going in maybe at a later part of their
I think be open to anything. And I tell people at all levels of their career, I've always had a very open mind toward where my path would lead me. And I think and having support at home obviously is very important as well. And I have to give credit to my husband and daughter who said, "This is amazing. You love the FCC. You love the people there. This is an opportunity." And I just felt like it was such an opportunity to really make an impact and work with people who felt so passionately about not just the government's role, but helping industry, because ultimately it is sort of a virtuous cycle. So I would give the advice that just be open to opportunities and don't limit yourself by geography or sort of your own, what you think your career trajectory has to be. Be open.
That's great. And maybe a little fun one to wrap up. So obviously you were in the high altitude balloon business. We've also seen, these suborbital tourism, and Blue Origin and
Yeah.
Virgin. For a while there was talk about Worldview or some of these other. So if you were going to go on a short duration suborbital tourist ride, would you go in a high altitude balloon or would you not go at all? Which is maybe where some of the audience might land.
Yeah. I think I want to go in a rocket, but I want to be very careful about my attire. And I don't wanna go alone. There has to be, I have to have friends with me.
Fair
But
enough.
I mean, balloons are great, but I do believe that a rocket would just that you get a lot of cachet.
Yeah, it'd be a little more
Yeah.
exhilarating.
I would want it to be longer. I know this last one was 11 minutes, which is so cool, but I feel like I wanna go for a few days, maybe not 9
Oh,
months,
that's where
but,
the balloon comes in, right? You get the longer on
right.
station.
Yeah, because I feel like the longer you see different
11 minutes.
right?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, I'm
Yeah,
standing at my Keurig machine making a coffee. It's like 12 minutes sometimes. So I'm like, "Why is this thing
exactly,
so slow?" It's like, "Oh, they've already had waitlisted and they're back, and I'm still waiting on my French roast coffee."
exactly. Yeah, so I would love something longer. A week would be fun, just
Yeah,
to
This
yeah,
keeps
really
yeah.
this keeps we went from hours to days to now up to a week. I think
I
you're
think a
looking
week's
at
good.
your duration.
I don't wanna go to Mars. I don't know about you, Julie. That's too long. 9 months to get there and then years to get back. No way. I'm like, "What?"
I
That's a commitment. That's a
I
commitment.
saw The Martian and, poopy potatoes.
I don't right. That's scary. I mean, that's on the verge of scary to me. That's not even not appealing. That's scary.
Stick with the astronaut ice cream and, Tang,
Yeah, yeah, we could do that.
right,
Yes, have that
yeah.
for a week.
Yeah,
Yeah.
totally, totally. I have so loved talking to you all and am just thrilled that the podcast is racing the space ecosystem. It's been so fun. I really just think you all are brilliant and funny.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you being on. I've learned a ton today. This has been fascinating, and I think it opens up a whole different part of the industry to people that they might not be exposed to. So thank you for your service at the
Thank
FCC
you.
and for coming on and talking to us about it.